For years, she remained the palace's steel spine, silent, unwavering, unshaken. But now, after seasons of turmoil and whispers from the shadows, Princess Anne has stepped forward, her voice slicing through the royal fog, with a revelation that could annihilate Meghan Markle's standing forever. What she said about Archie's birth certificate didn't just stun the crown, it shattered the very foundation of the Sussex fairy tale. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For decades, Princess Anne had been the royal family's quiet constant, the figure who never courted headlines, never fed rumours, never flinched in the face of scandal. While others stumbled through interviews and issued carefully polished statements, Anne endured. She absorbed. She watched. Palace insiders often whispered that if the monarchy had a memory, it lived inside her. So when word began to spread that Anne had finally spoken not in vague platitudes, not in veiled diplomacy, but with unmistakable intent, even the most hardened royal correspondents felt something shift. This was not another fleeting controversy. This was different. This was personal. And it was laced with a gravity that made even senior courtiers uneasy. The lead-up had been quiet, almost invisible to the public. A series of closed-door meetings, hurried rearrangements of long-standing schedules, late-night arrivals at Clarence House that were never recorded on the court circular. Anne was seen entering private sessions with King Charles, her expression unreadable, her movements brisk, purposeful. Prince William was present too, arriving separately, leaving later, eyes fixed forward, jaw set. Staff members noticed the tension long before any words reached the press. Files were requested from archives rarely touched. Secure rooms were booked without explanation. And somewhere in the middle of this tightening circle, something leaked. It wasn't a document at first, it was a sentence. A fragment passed between two aides, then overheard, then quietly carried into the outer rings of royal reporting. Anne is furious. Another followed. It's about the birth certificate. By the time the whispers reached Fleet Street, they had already evolved into speculation, into dread-tinged curiosity. And then, without warning, Anne let it be known she would not remain silent. Those who expected softness were stunned. Those who expected ambiguity were shaken. Her tone, by all accounts, was not emotional, not reactive, but something far more devastating, controlled, deliberate, sharpened by years of restraint. She did not ramble. She did not hedge. She chose each word with surgical care, and when she spoke of Archie's birth certificate, she did not frame it as confusion or clerical error. She framed it as a question of integrity, of truth, of whether the monarchy itself had been deliberately misled. Behind palace walls, a word began to circulate, not printed, not confirmed, but repeated in hushed voices with growing alarm. Forged. Buckingham Palace reacted not with reassurance, but with movement. Meetings multiplied. Advisors were summoned back from leave. Communications teams were pulled into emergency sessions, tasked not with shaping a narrative, but with containing one. Phones rang through the night. Long-standing protocols were suddenly revisited, because Anne's statement hadn't simply pointed toward a problem, it had implied a breach. A violation not just of royal custom, but of trust. And within an institution built on lineage and legitimacy, there are few accusations more dangerous. What made her intervention even more unsettling was its timing. Anne had weathered abdications, divorces, scandals, leaked tapes, explosive interviews. She had outlasted them all without public commentary. So why now? Why this? Insiders suggested there had been a final trigger, a detail that crossed a line even she could not ignore, something in black and white, something that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or resentment, something that once seen could not be unseen. Because Anne was not merely reacting, she was preparing, and when she spoke, it was not to speculate but to warn, to signal that the palace was no longer dealing in whispers but in records, not in impressions but in ink. And as her words echoed through royal corridors, one chilling implication took hold. This was only the beginning. But the real shock wasn't what Anne said, it was what she hinted at next. A buried document, sealed since 2019, that holds the power to unravel everything Meghan fought to build. For years, the official record stood unquestioned, a routine document in the archives. But what if that birth certificate wasn't as ordinary as the public believed? Princess Anne's comments forced a second look, and what was discovered inside that seemingly innocuous paper could change royal history and destroy Meghan's credibility for good. The birth certificate, filed in 2019, was initially treated like any other royal document, reviewed by press, confirmed by officials, and then quietly archived. It named the child, marked the time, identified the hoe. Spittle. On the surface, everything seemed in order. But even then, whispers were circulating beneath the media's polished headlines. Royal staff, who had handled dozens of similar certificates, noted something off, something oddly curated. It wasn't just the wording. It was what was missing, what wasn't said. And now, years later, Princess Anne's public warning has cracked open the very heart of those suspicions. What the world once accepted as fact is now unraveling under the weight of deliberate deception. In the weeks following Archie's birth, subtle discrepancies began to emerge, triggering a quiet unease inside Buckingham Palace. A small group of aides flagged unusual language in the document. The mother's name had been altered, her identity reduced to a title, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex, stripping away Rachel Meghan Markle, the legal name that should have been used. The change was so minor, so easily overlooked, it almost slipped through undetected. But to royal protocol watchdogs, it was thunderous. And now, with Anne's revelation, that minor change has taken on sinister weight. Because it wasn't just cosmetic, it was strategic. A concealed move to manipulate how the child's status, parentage, and future claims would be perceived. And the timing? Chilling. The amendment appeared weeks after the original document had been filed, and its authorization, marked as restricted under internal palace security. What added fuel to this firestorm was the sudden appearance of palace memos dated mid-2019. These were no ordinary administrative notes. They carried the imprint of high-ranking aides, referencing a Category 3 revision with an attached visibility lock. One line stood out, haunting in its brevity: omission requested. Purpose undisclosed. Proceed with top-level caution. No sign-off from Queen Elizabeth, no public explanation. When asked about it recently, Anne didn't hesitate. Her words sliced through the fog. It was an omission with intent. And then there's the matter of the clerk. Senior Records Officer Jonathan Fielding was known for his meticulous nature, loyal, precise, and by the book. He handled the original documentation. Yet after the amendment was filed, he disappeared from his role entirely. No public farewell, no statement, no reappointment. Some staff were told he took a personal leave. Others said he was pressured into silence. What's certain is this: his exit coincides precisely with the birth certificate controversy, and no one inside the palace has been able or willing to explain why. Meghan's team, realizing the narrative was spinning beyond their control, sprang into action. Crisis PR calls were made, media allies were summoned, carefully worded statements resurfaced, claiming the change was made at the palace's direction. But insiders knew that excuse was flimsy. The palace never alters such documents without clear constitutional reason. The very idea that it would request anonymity for a royal contradicted decades of protocol. As reporters began sniffing around again, legal threats followed. But it was too late. Anne's voice had given the issue new life. The whispers were now shouts. But what Princess Anne truly feared wasn't the document itself, it was what it represented, a deliberate erasure. And the motive behind it had royal insiders trembling. Why would a mother erase her own name from her child's birth certificate? That's the question that sent royal aides, media hounds, and Anne herself into a frenzy. Because this wasn't a typo, it was a move, calculated, strategic. And Anne claims it was done to manipulate not just the monarchy but public sympathy itself. The initial filing of Archie's birth certificate on May 17, 2019, raised no eyebrows. It appeared routine, standard, legally sound. But then came the correction. Quietly amended weeks later, Meghan's full name, Rachel Meghan Markle, vanished. In its place, a cold, impersonal title, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. What had once been an intimate connection between mother and child was now a sterilized piece of royal branding. When the change was discovered, speculation exploded. Why erase her own identity from her child's record? And more urgently, who authorized it? Meghan's team claimed Buckingham Palace demanded it. The palace, in a rare move, pushed back, refusing to take the fall, and caught in the middle was a question no one could confidently answer. Was this a legal adjustment or a royal cover-up? Anne wasn't convinced by the shifting narratives. To her, this wasn't just a clerical quirk. It was part of a broader strategy, a rewriting of roles meant to alter perception both inside the palace and out. Behind closed doors, she called the change what others feared to say aloud: deliberate misdirection. She didn't mince words. Titles mean nothing when truth is altered. That statement, once leaked to royal insiders, was repeated in hushed tones across courtier circles. Because Anne wasn't just angry, she was accusing, not just of arrogance or entitlement, but of manipulation. She believed this move was designed to weaponize ambiguity, to insulate Meghan from accountability, while leveraging royal branding for maximum public appeal. Legal minds within the monarchy began analyzing the amendment under a new light. If the original name had been removed, could it affect Archie's future legal entitlements, his position in the line of succession, his citizenship, should it ever be contested? The birth certificate wasn't just symbolic, it was constitutional. Royal documentation doesn't live in isolation, it carries historical and dynastic weight. Even the slightest alteration, especially one made without transparency, could unravel decades of precedent. And worse, it could suggest that personal preference was allowed to override institutional protocol. That notion left senior advisors shaken. As reporters began probing deeper, Meghan and Harry fell into silence. No interviews, no clarifications. Only vague, deflective statements from their legal representatives who warned of defamatory assumptions and distorted narratives. Behind the scenes, however, the couple was anything but quiet. Meghan's attorneys reached out to royal media outlets, cautioning against framing the name change as suspicious. At the same time, unofficial surrogates began spinning alternate explanations claiming the title emphasized royal respect, not personal erasure. But to many, the timing reeked of desperation. The narrative was slipping from their hands, and Anne's voice was proving impossible to silence. To some, it seemed like the climax of a bitter war over truth. But those watching closely knew better, because Anne wasn't done. She had one more revelation to unleash, one that would reach far beyond paperwork and public opinion, one that would turn suspicion into something far more dangerous. And just when royal watchers thought the storm had peaked, Anne dropped another bomb, one that sent shockwaves through Clarence House and sent Meghan reeling. In a private corridor within Balmoral Castle, Anne reportedly posed a question to Charles that left him white as a sheet. Is he even eligible? The remark, explosive in implication, challenged not just Meghan's integrity, but Archie's royal destiny itself. What followed was a chain of royal panic, covert investigation, and a king who suddenly doubted everything. That question, uttered with deliberate weight, hung in the air, like smoke. For Anne, it was no longer about titles or public perception. It had escalated to something far more consequential: legitimacy. Not in the emotional sense, but in the dynastic one. In a monarchy built on bloodlines, legality, and duty, lineage isn't symbolic, it's constitutional. If something about Archie's birth had been misrepresented, then every future claim, every inherited right, every title he might one day hold was now under threat. Anne knew this. Charles knew it. And in that instant, Balmoral transformed from a royal retreat into a war room. Behind the palace walls, there were already rumblings, conflicting stories about the exact circumstances surrounding Archie's registration. Some insiders whispered that Harry and Meghan had initially refused to sign certain documentation, causing unusual delays. Others claimed palace aides were barred from reviewing drafts of the certificate before filing. Meghan's defenders insisted the confusion was caused by the firm itself, by outdated protocols and internal miscommunication. But Anne wasn't buying it. She believed what she saw was intentional, not accidental. A game being played with royal documents, orchestrated to create maximum confusion and minimum accountability. King Charles, already burdened by the weight of a fractured monarchy, was plunged into internal crisis. Privately, he sought advice from constitutional experts. If Archie's documentation was compromised, what were the implications? Could a child born Anne, under a royal title but filed under altered or obscured terms, still claim full succession rights? The legal answers were murky, but politically the damage was clear. Any doubt, no matter how thin, was enough to fracture public trust. The king was now being forced to question not only Meghan's actions, but his own judgment in allowing these issues to fester unchecked. Prince William, though silent in public, was a different force behind the scenes. Those close to him say he had long harboured concerns about the Sussexes' handling of their royal duties, but this was something else. This was institutional betrayal, and while he refrained from public commentary, aides reported his presence in nearly every legal meeting, his tone focused and unsparing. He wasn't just protecting the crown's image, he was defending its structure. As the fallout deepened, the palace took action. Websites referencing Archie's title were quietly adjusted. Mentions of his placement in the line of succession were temporarily redacted, only to reappear days later with modified language. The official explanation was technical maintenance, but within the walls of Clarence House the real reason was fear, a sense that something had slipped through the cracks and, if exposed, could trigger a scandal unlike anything since the abdication crisis. What began as a question whispered in a hallway had ignited an inferno. And yet, Anne's fury was far from extinguished, because she knew the damage done to the monarchy was not just the result of one signature or one misfiled form. No, this was deeper. This was about trust, about betrayal, and her eyes, once fixed on Charles, now turned sharply elsewhere. But the heart of Anne's fury didn't lie with Charles, it burned for someone else entirely, because behind every manipulated document, she claimed, was a deeper betrayal. Before her passing, Queen Elizabeth allegedly issued a quiet directive regarding all royal birth records, transparency above all. But according to Anne, Meghan chose a different path, one that defied the late Queen's express wishes. That act of defiance now stands at the centre of Anne's crusade, and she's determined to expose it. Queen Elizabeth understood the delicate balance between royal privacy and public trust better than anyone. In her later years, she grew increasingly aware of how a single misstep, a single hidden truth, could splinter the monarchy's foundation. So, she made it clear in private council and handwritten notes to senior members, when it came to royal birth records, there would be no room for grey areas. She reportedly told Anne in confidence, "We don't hide names. We don't erase blood." It wasn't just a matter of formality, it was her final stand on royal integrity. But as Anne now claims, Meghan ignored that instruction. And the decision to override it didn't just go against protocol, it went against the Queen herself. Anne had always been closest to the Queen when it came to upholding duty over emotion. In her eyes, every directive from her mother wasn't merely a preference, it was policy. She remembered those hushed, meaningful exchanges in Windsor corridors, where the late Queen would reflect on past crises and quietly lay down rules meant to shield the monarchy from repeating history's mistakes. So when Meghan's team allegedly altered the presentation of Archie's birth record without full approval, Anne saw it as an act of rebellion, not confusion. And worse, she believed it was done with full awareness of the Queen's standing instruction. In the weeks leading up to the public release of the document, there were warnings. Internal messages were reportedly sent to Harry and Meghan's office cautioning against using only titles, urging them to retain traditional naming structures for clarity and compliance. Those messages were ignored. Instead, what followed was a version of the certificate stripped of personal identity and dressed in royal insulation. When palace officials raised concern, they were met with silence or, in some cases, told to respect the couple's privacy. But to Anne, this wasn't privacy. This was erasure, camouflaged as autonomy. What stung even more was the Queen's reaction. According to sources within her trusted circle, Her Majesty was privately disappointed. Not outwardly scathing, but undeniably shaken. She reportedly confided in a senior aide, saying, "They've turned something sacred into something strategic." It was a quiet heartbreak, one the Pubble IC never saw, and Anne never forgot. That moment, to her, became a turning point. From that day on, Anne watched Meghan not with neutrality, but with sharpened eyes, no longer seeing her as a new royal adjusting to tradition, but as someone rewriting it for her own gain. So when Anne finally spoke out, her words weren't just her own. They echoed with the force of her mother's legacy. She wasn't defending a piece of paper, she was defending a crown's covenant with its people. The Queen's word was not optional, Anne declared, her voice calm but cutting. And in that single sentence, she placed the weight of the monarchy's highest authority directly in opposition to Meghan's choice. As the weight of royal tradition clashed with modern manipulation, a new storm was brewing, this time not in the press, but behind palace gates, in a meeting described by insiders as explosive. Senior royals gathered in secret to address the fallout from Anne's statement. At the table, William, grim-faced and focused, Edward, cautious but firm, and Anne, unapologetic. What began as a conversation turned into a confrontation, and Meghan's name echoed like a curse through the chamber walls. It was never intended to be a formal council, but as the revelations surrounding Archie's birth certificate escalated, there was no alternative. Anne demanded the meeting take place behind closed doors, no aides, no distractions, just the inner circle of senior working royals who still bore the responsibility of protecting the crown. The energy in the room was described as volatile from the outset. Tension crackled between duty and diplomacy. Anne wasted no time slamming the full weight of her evidence on the table and daring anyone to dismiss it. She wasn't asking for support, she was demanding action. William sat at the edge of a precipice. The very name that now threatened the monarchy's transparency was the same name as his brother's wife. And yet, with every detail Anne laid out, his resolve shifted. Those present noticed the flicker in his expression the moment he crossed the threshold between blood and responsibility. He didn't argue, he didn't defend, he listened. And when he finally spoke, his voice was flat, cold, stripped of the emotion that had once defined his relationship with Harry. "We've protected too much for too long," he said. It was a line that signaled surrender. Not to Anne, but to the truth. What shocked many, however, was Edward. Typically reserved, the quiet observer in most royal debates, he leaned in this time. With calm but undeniable force, he broke his silence. "The monarchy isn't theirs to reshape," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "If we allow this to stand, we lose more than credibility, we lose control." His stance added unexpected gravity to the confrontation, tipping the balance in Anne's favor. The most chilling moment came when Anne, without raising her voice, declared, "This ends now." 3 words that struck with more power than any official proclamation. According to one insider, her tone held finality, not suggestion. She wasn't opening discussion, she was closing it. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The family reached a painful but necessary consensus. A formal inquiry must be launched into the handling and alteration of Archie's birth documentation. The stakes were too high, the damage already too deep. And for the monarchy to survive with its dignity intact, the truth had to be pursued no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Harry and Meghan were reportedly informed after the meeting concluded. Not invited, not consulted, merely notified. A calculated move that reflected the shift in royal attitude from accommodation to containment. The decision sent a clear message. The Sussexes were no longer participants in the inner sanctum, they were subjects of inquiry. But as the royals moved toward resolute Ion, Meghan prepared her counterstrike, a bold, aggressive maneuver that would flip public opinion overnight. Faced with public scrutiny and internal backlash, Meghan didn't retreat, she went on the attack. Legal threats flew, press allies were mobilized, and private investigators were suddenly sniffing around Anne's old interviews. But the more she pushed, the more she exposed, and it may have only quickened her downfall. Within hours of Anne's remarks shaking the foundations of royal tradition, Meghan's legal team sprang into action. Cease and desist letters began circulating to British tabloids, royal commentators, and even former palace staff who had spoken too freely. The tone was unmistakable, aggressive, uncompromising, and packed with veiled consequences. At the center of these legal strikes was one clear demand: silence. But Meghan wasn't only aiming to shut down voices, she was orchestrating a narrative overhaul. Her public relations machine kicked into overdrive, striking exclusive deals with sympathetic media platforms, feeding them a curated timeline that painted her as the misunderstood victim of a jealous institution. Carefully worded articles appeared overnight, all echoing the same refrain: this was a targeted attack on a woman of color who had dared to modernize the monarchy. But behind the curtain of carefully managed headlines, there was chaos. Anne's camp wasn't backing down, and neither were the questions that had now taken root in the public consciousness. In a surprising twist, Meghan's own media blitz seemed to amplify the controversy rather than extinguish it. Comment sections, once heavily moderated, exploded with backlash. Hashtags that had previously trended in her favor began to flip. #WeStandWithAnne surged online, while accusations of calculated deflection flooded social feeds. The court of public opinion was no longer predictable, and Meghan's grip on the narrative was slipping. Adding to the internal strain was a reported rift between Meghan and Harry himself. Sources close to the Sussex circle suggested Harry had urged a quieter, more strategic response, warning that escalating the conflict could turn even longtime allies against them. But Meghan pushed forward, determined to maintain control. In desperation, she reportedly placed several late-night calls directly to King Charles, hoping to bypass protocol and plead her case. None were answered. The silence from the monarch wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. The firm was circling its wagons, and for the first time, Meghan stood outside of it. Bahi's team then took a more dangerous route. They began combing through Anne's decades-long royal service for inconsistencies, seeking anything that could be repackaged and weaponized against her. Archived interviews, offhand remarks, and dated footage were clipped and edited to suggest bias. But the public didn't buy it. Anne's legacy, forged through duty and silence, proved difficult to tarnish. In fact, the smear campaign only served to harden support for her, casting Meghan's strategy as vindictive rather than vindicated. What had begun as a fierce counterattack was quickly becoming a PR implosion. The harder Meghan fought to bury Anne's claims, the more credible they appeared. Her moves were no longer being viewed as protective, they were being interpreted as panic. And panic in the royal world is blood in the water. And then, just as the legal chaos reached its height, a figure stepped forward from the past, one who had been watching silently and was finally ready to speak. She had stayed silent for years. But now, the midwife allegedly present at Archie's birth has broken her silence in a private, confidential briefing leaked only to royal insiders. Her statement, simple but chilling, confirmed Anne's worst fears. "I was told to omit a detail. I didn't ask why." What was that detail, and why did Meghan want it hidden? The revelation came not from a press release or palace announcement, but through a leaked document marked strictly confidential, internal use only. It had been buried in royal archives under sealed protocol, part of a larger collection of postnatal documentation meant to remain untouched, unless requested by senior counsel. But when Anne pressed for a deeper probe, citing inconsistencies and deliberate omissions, the midwife's recorded testimony surfaced unexpectedly. Until that moment, she had been a footnote in the public narrative, a professional presence, anonymous and uncontroversial. Now, she was a key witness in a scandal that threatened to engulf the monarchy. The briefing itself was brief but loaded with consequence. According to the midwife, she was instructed by someone she referred to only as an American representative to withhold a certain line of information during the final certification process. The instruction wasn't explained, and the midwife claimed she didn't question it at the time, believing it had come with senior-level approval. But now, with the full context laid bare, her words took on a far more sinister weight. What had been omitted, and more importantly, why? Royal insiders reviewing the file speculated that it may have involved the maternal name section, or potentially something deeper, an inconsistency in the declaration that could call the document's validity into question. Palace officials, once made aware of the midwife's resurfaced statement, scrambled to cross-reference dates, locations, and timelines. Her account aligned with other internal communications, from the time brief mentions of alternative phrasing and non-standard adjustments made in response to direct requests. No one had questioned it then. But under the weight of Anne's campaign, everything was being re-examined. The midwife's calm admission so plainly delivered sent shockwaves through the royal corridors. She didn't accuse, she didn't sensationalize, she simply stated what happened, and the clarity of her recollection made it impossible to dismiss. Sources close to Princess Anne say she was privately devastated by the testimony. Those who witnessed her reaction described something rare tears, not from shock but from the vindication that came with heartbreak. For Anne, this was no longer about proving a point, it was about confirming that the monarchy had been compromised from within. A system built on precision, transparency, and tradition had been undermined by secrecy, and now that breach was on full display. The emotional toll was heavy, but the resolve it produced was heavier. With the midwife's statement now circulating behind palace gates, pressure mounted for a formal public inquiry. Whispers of potential criminality began to surface. Royal historians warned that this level of documentation tampering could have long-reaching consequences for future generational records. Constitutional experts hinted at possible legal implications depending on what, exactly, had been hidden and who had issued the instruction. As the monarchy braces for the storm to reach its apex, all eyes now turned to King Charles, whose final decision could decide Meghan's fate once and for all. It comes down to one man. King Charles, caught between legacy and love, must now choose whether to shield Meghan and preserve peace, or follow Anne's path and sever the Sussexes for good. His next move may not only define his reign, but mark the beginning of a royal war the world will never forget. For days the king remained out of sight, locked in private chambers with advisors, aides, and his own conflicted thoughts. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier. This was no ceremonial dilemma, this was a crucible. To act against Meghan would risk widening the already gaping divide between father and son. But to remain passive, to protect her in the face of growing proof and public fury, would invite the slow erosion of everything the monarchy claimed to stand for. Charles had seen his mother navigate crises, but this was different. This wasn't about scandal, it was about survival. And the enemy wasn't on the outside this time. It was within the family. Anne's unrelenting pressure could not be ignored. Neither could William's quiet ultimatum. The future king had made it clear he would not inherit a crown built on compromised truths. Behind the scenes, even once neutral voices began to harden. Senior aides began reviewing security budgets, travel arrangements, patronage lists. Meghan and Harry's remaining privileges, already fragile, hung by a thread. No announcements had been made, but within the palace, preparations were underway for what many saw as inevitable. Stripping titles, ending stipends, a complete institutional severance. Then came the final envelope, delivered in person by Anne, marked for the king's eyes only. Its contents remain a mystery, but palace whispers suggest it contained the unredacted transcript of the midwife's confidential briefing, along with a personal note from Anne herself, a plea not as a sister, but as the last line of defense between monarchy and manipulation. Charles received it without a word. He read it alone, and now the time has come. The king walks into the council room alone, the great oak doors shutting behind him with a thud that echoes like a warning. No one speaks. No announcements have been made. But the silence itself is deafening. And so, the world waits with bated breath for the monarch's next move. For one thing is certain, Princess Anne's silence is broken, and the monarchy will never sound the same again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.